We're recording. We should be live. Okay. Let's give people a couple of minutes to come in. And Amy, it may be you and you. So I hope you're full of wonderful advice.
It's fine.
Okay.
I have a panel tomorrow, and I don't know who's in the panel with me either. It might be just me.
Well, I had gotten replies from her that everything was good, but
Yeah.
you know, things do happen sometimes.
Right, exactly. Stuff.
Give it like another minute or so and see who we got coming in. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. Hi, I'm Penny from Eisenhower Library. Thank you for joining us. And we do have other things going on today for Comic-Con, so we hope that you log on after this. We have a Soul Creators panel with Mark Crilly, Jean Ha, and Justin Castaneda, and a People of Color cosplay panel in the afternoon. So we hope that you all show up for that. Let's see, you're on webinar, so you do not have a microphone, you do not have a camera, so please make any of your questions in the Q&A or the chat. We'll be monitoring both. And your moderator is Anne Magnelli, who is right there. We have with us Amy Chu, who created Sea Sirens and Sky Island, the books. Sky Island just came out. When, Amy?
Oh my goodness, like last century, before the pandemic.
Wait, Sky Island did?
Oh, no. Sea Sirens came out, what, 2019? And the sequel, Sky Island, was really the summer of last year.
Okay, and I have read the first one and it was great, so you should make sure you get it. And we were hoping to have Kiku Hughes with us. We don't know where she is. We're sorry. So we have Amy, which is great. And I'm going to turn it over to Anna and Amy, and you guys enjoy yourselves. I'll be here for you.
All right, I think it's just us. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for coming, Amy. We really appreciate having you here. Is there anything you want to talk about first before, I have a few questions prepared, but is there anything like you just really want to let us know right now?
No. I'm normally in Princeton, New Jersey, but this weekend I'm in glorious Boston, where Fan Expo is currently happening. And I'm signing a lot of Wonder Woman comics and signing a lot of Red Sonja and other things that I've done. It's really fun. But I'm kind of happy for the break to, hang out with you guys.
Well, thank you. How did you kind of get started, like, in your career? Like, what kind of brought you into, the comic world? Was it something that, like, you always wanted to do as a kid, or maybe something that you discovered as a passion as you got older?
Oh, yeah, that's a funny question, because it's different for everybody. It's certainly different for me. Definitely not. I didn't really read comics growing up. I mean, of course I read Archie, things like that. I think everyone probably grew up with a little Archie. So I never really thought of myself as a comics fan per se. It was all an accident. I was trying to help a girlfriend of mine. She really wanted to write comics, and I come from a business background. And so I said, you write the comics, I'll figure out how to publish you, right? How hard can this be? So that's really kind of how it started. And her response was like, yeah, cool. But creative people are a little different. Maybe you should give it a try just so you understand how creative people think. And so I took the writing class. I'm like, cool. It's like, I'll write the script. And the instructor is an ex-Marvel editor. And he said, oh, actually, the script is really good, And I'm like, oh, well, that's a new one. I don't really write fiction. And so from there, it sort of,
just blossomed.
Got a little crazy, because then I was like, oh, I can actually be good at this. Let me just try to keep getting better at this. And so a little background too, the class was me and 12 guys. So it was definitely a little bit of like,
Boys
you
club
know,
kind of thing. Yeah.
these guys were kind of like, who are you and what are you doing here? You don't even know who Deadpool is. You don't belong here. They're really nice about it, but I think they were, they were real comics fans, and I just
Mhm.
didn't know that world at all. And so then I got a little bit of it is a little bit of that, like, what, you don't think I belong in the boys club? I'll show you. I'm gonna write Deadpool, even though I don't know who Deadpool is. So, I got a little crazy, and that sort of propelled me into this kind of obsession of like, I'll show you that I don't want to say any random person can do it, but if you really want to do something, you can do it.
Right. Nothing should stop you. You should always at least try.
Yeah. And I did write Deadpool for Marvel, just, and at that point, of course, everyone I knew was like, what are you doing?
So then as you're kind of creating, do you kind of create things that are more that speak to you more? Or as you're kind of making things, is it for people? Like, do they have a message? Do you have a vision like of this is gonna mean something to someone else?
That's a good question, because I think what really does motivate me is that I'm doing it for other people, but it is also has to come from myself. And that's something I think that was very different, that it makes it worth it, is that not only am I doing something for other people, but it's also for myself. So, that's kind of like, it's both. It's both.
Oh, I get that. Is there one that kind of like sticks out in your brain from like, all your past works? Like, this is something that really I made for whoever it could be, or even for yourself. They like had a very strong meaning, a very like strong emotional connection to
Sure.
for you.
I would say like my first book was actually Poison Ivy, from the Batman universe. If
Mhm.
you know who Poison Ivy is, she was actually created. So like I know all this stuff now. She was actually created in the 60s, and she's never had her own series, like nothing. And her origin story is just like all this random stuff. It just kept changing. And it's one of those things where, well, that's not right. If you really
Yeah.
think about Poison Ivy, she's kind of like Mother Nature. If you really think about her powers, they're pretty extraordinary, even greater than Batman. And what, she's going around kissing guys to death? I don't get it. So it was a little bit about, for me, I'm like, I think I can do better. And I think that the fans deserve better. So that kind of like drove me to like sort of cast her a little bit different,
Mhm.
because she's also supposed to be a PhD. And boy, does she not behave like PhDs I know,
Yeah, I
So
can definitely see that.
yeah. So it was a kind of recasting of like, what is a really smart woman actually, she's kind of half the plant. I mean, she don't really think in those terms, honestly. She thinks like a scientist, at least in my interpretation.
Oh, sure.
And yeah, and I think it did well. I mean, even now in this at this convention, that was 2016. I still have people coming up and having me sign those comics. So it's kind of cool.
Do you feel that you enjoy maybe writing more like those villainish kind of characters more so than like heroes? I always find villains like way more interesting than heroes.
Well,
There's just
those
so
for
much
sure.
there.
Yeah, it's harder to write heroes sometimes. Like, so I've done some Wonder Woman, not a lot, but enough that I know it's hard to write Wonder Woman. And heroes are not necessarily boring, but they have rules they got to stick to be heroic. Whereas villains can do almost anything. And someone like Poison Ivy, I don't really view her as necessarily villainous. She just doesn't have the same moral code as the rest of us, So, or some of us.
Let's see. Hold on, my phone turned off on me. All right. So then, since we're talking about like very specific characters, is there like a character that's very popular that you think would be very different if like a woman wrote them? Like maybe Hulk, if like a woman's perspective on Hulk, how do you envision that? Not so much like She-Hulk, but like, actual Hulk.
I mean, there are plenty. So, I mean, there are a lot more. And I want to be careful here because there are a lot more women writing now. Before, even 10 years ago, there is a very different matter altogether. And there have been women, very few. Becky Cloonan basically wrote some Batman, and I do think as a woman of color, certainly that does inform how I write certain characters. Perhaps they're different from, but a lot of I shouldn't say a lot. Very good writers, like very good male writers, can write very convincing female characters, absolutely. But I think it is, I would be very interested to see, like if it's Marvel or DC, I don't care, having all women write all the characters and see how that turns out. Because I think there is a difference, for some things, I have written male characters and I don't want to be it like, oh, a female wrote this, necessarily. But I do think that our experience does affect or, add to how we characterize certain characters. But I think the real question, though, is being aware of a more diverse audience. And that's what we should really be focused on, that plenty of women, in fact, more, I think, more women are buying comics, like putting down good money for comics. You better be, thinking about that while you're writing your story.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree. It's definitely like, what we kind of bring from, the years that we lived before that would influence, our art or our writing. So I can definitely see where you're coming from, where like it's just those life experiences that would change kind of how someone would be written down as a character. So in your career, what would you say was probably like the hardest barrier for you to break through? What was like that moment you're like, I finally made it, or that was like the hardest hill for you to kind of climb through to get to like where you're at right now?
Oh, well, we almost never feel like we've made it. It's like, we could be unemployed any month now. You just don't know. So I don't know that I feel like I made it, although, actually I have enough writing credits, I guess.
I would say you made it.
Yeah, I guess I made it. The hardest barrier, I think a lot of things are imposed barriers, first of all, and self-imposed in that it's very easy to talk yourself out of anything. Like I said, my first class, it was just me, the sole woman, and the rest of the guys. It would have been very easy to say, you know what, they're right. I don't really know anything. And, this is a boys' club, just pack it up and go home, and there's also an age thing too, right? Because I'm coming at this much older, honestly, than most. I'm mid-career, essentially. I had 2 kids. I already had a really good couple of jobs, and just to clarify, so I started my first writing class was 2011. So 10 years ago, and I was already 44. So I'm 53. Did I do the math right? I'm 53 now. So
sounds right to me.
Yeah. So, and it's very easy, certainly at a certain age, you're like, I'm too old to do this. I'm already doing all these other things. I hear this too. It would have been very easy to talk myself out of that, especially with kids too. It's like, what the hell? Excuse me. What the
What's
heck?
a lot to juggle? Yeah, of course.
So there's a little bit of that, whenever you change tracks in such a major way, it is a real, kind of, it can be daunting, I guess, if you actually thought about it. I didn't really think about it that way, so I think that's why I was able to do it.
Right. I think also like having people who have had like more life experiences, coming into like you said, like mid-career, it's also a very big important thing, for diversity's sake. We don't want a bunch of just fresh out of college 20-somethings doing everything, right? There's people who are very practiced and know exactly what all the things they've done before. You can bring that to the table.
Yeah, if I think about it, I wouldn't have been a writer, in my mid-20s. I just didn't have that experience. I didn't have the voice. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know that I would have had the interest if I had the same opportunity. So I think it's just kind of part of one's evolution, I guess, as a person,
What would you say was maybe like the first kind of comic book character that spoke to you? Like, was there one that like really stuck out in your mind? Like, oh man, I really love this character so much. They mean like everything to me, or they really like got you into maybe writing comics a certain way, or like change your style?
No, I think it was really more the writers themselves, because I had to basically, I really felt like I was at a comics deficit, given that so many of these writers or artists had grown up and read so many comics, and here I am coming at it much later in life. And so I was reading a lot and trying to, catch up. There's no way one can catch up, but you start understanding writers. And I felt like, oh, you start developing your taste of like who you like. And I've discovered I like dark humor a lot more. There's certain things so it's not even the characters so much as how the writers sort of infuse that voice into those characters.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Going to be quiet, but I have a question. So many of the comics that I see coming out, especially from women, seem to be from really tiny presses or more independent type books than obviously Marvel or DC or something like that. Is that your experience, or is that just what I'm seeing, or what do you think about that?
Well, so here's what I think. Okay, so now you're going to make me pull out my MBA background, right? So when we first of all, we need to define what are comics, and most people tend to define comics very narrowly as what we possibly have grown up with, or which are the monthly comics that are superhero. What, of course, the definition of comics is much broader, right? You have a comic strip, you have web comics now, you have the middle grade graphic novels, and the monthlies, and certainly a whole slew of non-superhero books. We've got horror, we've got other genres, and really superhero, it's true, has been dominated by men, both artists and writers. Now, it's not like I've done an analysis, but for sure, outside that, women in some cases are actually the majority of creators in that space. Possibly for web comics. I mean, if you go to Webtoons, Tapas, the other digital platform, and young children's books and things like that, I think it's a very different picture. So, and I think that the mainstream comics publishers have also realized that the audience has changed. So you're seeing a lot more titles, and part of it too is they're more profitable. Okay, so they're much more profitable than the honestly, the monthly Batman. Superhero Girls blows that out of the water. So and I think that the mainstream publishers, it took them a shockingly long time to figure that out. And now also there's been regime change, and all of a sudden the mandate is, these are profitable books. What are you guys doing? So.
And then my next question is books about, because I'm the teen person here, and so I look at a lot of what's coming out in the young adult market. And right now it's very heavily LGBTQ, and also very heavily people of color. And so I'm wondering how you see that reflected in comics, or if it's reflected in comics the same way.
I think it will vary from publisher to publisher. Certainly I will say the creators are like, oh, nobody's going to hire me now because I'm white cis male, where I'm like, you know what, just go through the list and see who's being published. Okay. I have not displaced you, honestly. All right. You still have plenty of male creators who are writing 7 books a month. I don't think there's that problem, just because we might be taking 10, 15% of the titles. And when I say take, that's diversification is a whole nother thing too. So I think there is an interest, certainly. Well, also don't forget, we're hired by editors. The editors have changed over tremendously. I would say at Marvel, at least 50% women, possibly more. Okay, so that is really what's driving change more than anything else. The editors hire according to their own taste, and now you're seeing women who are like, well, I'm now the editor. This is who I'm going to hire, and these are the kind of stories I want. Albeit, of course, at the top, you still have men who've been there for decades, very experienced, and they have their own taste. But the new editor-in-chief at DC, she's a woman, her boss is a woman, and her boss's boss is a woman. So
cool. I didn't know that. That's
I also
really
didn't know that. That's fascinating.
yeah, most people don't know that. It's In fact, most of the people necessarily in the business might not know that, but I know that. So
Yeah, interesting. Okay, Anna, back to you. Sorry.
No, please. I'd like to know, like, maybe what has been like the strangest place or thing that's given you like inspiration for some of your work, and what kind of came as like a result of that. Do you have like a funny story that kind of either completed or didn't complete?
Like an event or a place I've been or a situation?
Anything. Was there something that like, oh man, this would make a really funny story, or this would make a really funny,
Oh, all the time.
anything, even if it didn't come to completion, like, you kind of planned it out in the beginning phases.
One single event, because that's kind of, I think how a lot of people write is that they get inspiration for what they see around them. So there's always something kind of funny and interesting that happens. I have to jot it down because I'm like, oh, I can use this, for something. So that happens all the time. I'm trying to think of any one situation.
Like a specific one. It's hard, right? There's so many.
Yeah, well, also because, this is the other thing too, as a freelance person with multiple deadlines, it's like almost like being a journalist sometimes. You got deadlines all the time. I'm like, I got to get this issue in. And but I got 2 kids who are in soccer and I got to write at soccer practice. So, sometimes, things sort of, your environment also influences you. Even I wrote Red Sonja for the most part at the soccer field. So, and there's some really violent episodes in Red Sonja, while these kids are going around, basically kicking the ball around. So I don't know if there's any one single thing.
It could be a collection of things. If there's like, you can't quite pinpoint one.
Yeah, it's really more just the absurdity of all of it, that I'm trying to think if there's I do tend to put a lot of real life people into characters. Of course, I change it up a bit,
yeah.
Right? But, there's also that. So I can't really think of anything that just right off the top of my mind. But
do you see people and kind of go like, oh, you are definitely a character. Like you are someone I want to write about.
I'm not an artist. If I were an artist, I'd be like sketching that person, there's like sometimes very but more often than not it's like a composite of somebody, also because I do a lot of conventions and you do see a lot of people, but yeah, it's really there are it's really more, I get a little notion in my head that I would want to do this thing, like if you're familiar with Red Sonja, she's a mercenary. She's just kind of like a badass mercenary, although she does run around in chainmail bikini, which is hard to explain, honestly. But she's in the Conan universe, and because I wrote her going through a time portal to essentially present day New York City, it gave me a lot more latitude to do certain things, and so I just got this in my head that I really felt librarians needed to be more in comics. I mean, first of all, librarians basically buy the books, right? So I was like working out a storyline where I can incorporate some librarians into a Red Sonja story. So you may say, oh, that's really funny, but I'm like, so I know Karen Green, and she's a librarian at Columbia University. I'm like, I'm gonna put in a librarian who's working on her PhD from Columbia University, and she'll be like a really big character in this. So that, so that's like one of the things where I was like, I was so focused in doing that. I don't know if anyone appreciated it, but
I'm really sure. I'm sure definitely it resonated with like a few people who are like, me.
Right. I was hoping for that.
That's right. Yeah.
I do have some questions, maybe like if you can give some like advice, because me and Penny did very recently a comic camp where we had writers and artists, who were teenage, we're kind of like just starting to get into, making a comic strip, a very short web-based comic. And a lot of them wanted to know, like, kind of the steps that people took, or maybe even like the missteps people took. Like, do you have like really good career advice? And then maybe even like really bad career advice that you were given? You were like, I should have never done that. That was the worst possible thing I could have done for myself at that time.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad advice floating around, I think. Let me start off with what I consider the general advice I give everybody, because I do teach, I will start teaching at the School of Visual Arts this fall. I also teach at the Kubert School, the art school. And, you know, I generally try not to give too much broad, like I'll give a lot of tactical advice, but for writers in particular, you need to finish your work, you know, and that's the hardest part. And I think we get caught up, you know, of like, some advice really propels you to feel like you must be perfect. And I think that's just bad advice. Just focus on getting it done and move on to the next story. You know, there's a lot of sort of Alan Moore-ish type advice going around. You must do this, this, and this. And my advice is generally like, keep it short and finish it, you know, and then you move to the next stage. So there's also some advice floating around that I think should really be ignored as a writer. There's some merit to it, but this idea of looking at it as if you were a business person, which is actually how I entered the whole thing. It's like, oh, so let me do a strategic plan. Let me figure out the market, and I will write to target that market. And it was terrible. You know, it turns out that the stories that did the best for me were the ones that I considered unmarketable. My most popular story before I started getting Marvel DC work was about a woman in a nursing home with Alzheimer's. You tell me, how marketable is that in comics, right? If you were on the other side, like, I don't know, you know, I don't see the dollar signs behind this, right? It's really about your passion and the execution and the characterization that people are like, oh, I really love that story, you know? So you can't really attach this whole business kind of thinking necessarily to what you do as a creative person. So I would say just avoid all that kind of talk of, you know, let's try to figure out a horror is a big category. You should write horror. If you're not a horror writer, then don't do it. You must do what, you know, you find exciting and passionate for yourself.
I think too, with that kind of advice, whatever you're looking at that's popular in the market at that point, by the time you finish writing it and get someone to look at it, it's sorry, that left.
It's
that
done.
one's already gone.
It's done, you know, and then something fresh will come out and everyone's like, oh my gosh. And then that trend will start again. So it's useless. You can't chase after the trends, you know, already, you know, Marvel and DC are already 18 months ahead with what they're figuring out for their stories. So this very idea of like, it's popular now, they didn't really know at that time, you know? So you should do what you really want to do and not derivative of what somebody else did. You got to do what you want, the story that you want to tell. I think we do tend to be like, oh, we love Walking Dead, so I'm going to do Walking Dead. You can do that if you love that kind of thing anyway, but don't do it because you think it's going to sell super well and just because you feel like that's the thing you should do, or also honestly because you're such a huge fan. You can do that kind of thing, but start trying to figure out who you really are as a creator, whether you're a writer or an artist or both. Because more often than not, the stories are actually really quite personal. You know, usually I find inspiration frequently from, you know, so my most recent Wonder Woman story where I like to do intergenerational stories too. And it was about a woman who, again, a nursing home story. And because I was thinking about my great aunt Katie, you know, who was in a nursing home, who unfortunately died of COVID. You know, so I was thinking about her and I was thinking about her life and, you know, what's happened. You know, she had a very interesting life. And I'm thinking, oh, you know, one does not necessarily think of that as a Wonder Woman story, right? But she is a Wonder Woman. So I kind of, you know, built that in.
Interesting. And when you script, are you scripting to make it look like a movie script or a play?
No,
or are you just writing?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you do it?
So there's a lot of similarities, but you can tell when someone's doing that, and that's the wrong approach for comics in particular, because comic scripts, just like movie scripts, they're for a certain audience. Okay, comics, you are writing for the artist. Screenplays, you're writing for a lot of people, including if like animation, for example. I'm working on a Netflix animation. You're writing for the studio. You're writing for studio executives. You're not writing for the actual final reader. So the script is more of a blueprint. So if you are trying to be cinematic in your comic script, it's the wrong approach, because your comic artist, there's no motion, first of all. There's no blinking. You can't hear people's thoughts. So if you're doing all that kind of stuff, and also there's no sound. So your script actually has to be very specific, telling the artist, panel 1, establishing shot, people in a room, that kind of thing. It's very, very, it's almost like the minimalist approach to storytelling. So
Okay.
this idea of like swoop in, pan in, aerial view, you don't have that. There is no camera.
Has there been a time where you've written for an artist and they've come back with a design for your character that you didn't intend, but you ended up loving like their interpretation of it?
Oh, all the time, because I'm not an artist, and if you are good, you've gotten an artist who is better than you as a writer, which is frequently the case, right? So their interpretation should be hopefully a pleasant surprise. Well, also I work with a lot of established licensed characters too. Like I did some X-Files, so they have to render Mulder and Scully. Actually, Mulder was not there because it was alternate universe. So it was alternate universe where it was a story about Scully and Mulder's sister. So
Ooh.
yeah. So but in that case, they actually had to create Mulder's sister, but everything else was the same. So that's a case where it's rendered exactly how I would expect it to be. There have been certainly times where the art came back and it was rendered a lot sexier than I expected. I mean, if you read my scripts, they're not sexy. So, depending on the viewpoint and the experience of the artist, they may feel, certainly this has been the case since the 90s, where it's, oh, female character must be sexy. I'm like, she doesn't have to be sexy, that's a different battle altogether.
Have you ever I don't know what kind of control, I have friends who write picture books, I write novels, but I've just wondered, have you ever, like picture books, you have no say basically in your artist. If you're the writer, your illustrator is like, they don't even want you talking to each other most of the time. Just stay away from each other. So is that something that happens in comics, or do you often know who you're getting for your illustrator? Is it a surprise? Is it, yay, I got it?
It largely depends on the publisher and the editor. Typically a good editor will ask you or try to match you up, because we try to be more collaborative. So it's very rare that I have no say, first of all. Whenever that happens, it's usually like I did some Disney stuff, and they operate like that. They operate like a book publisher in some ways, where okay, just give us the script, we'll deal with the rest. Almost everyone else, there is a little back and forth. And if I happen to know the artist, then absolutely I will be messaging the person and it's like, so we can work together. If it is creator owned, meaning that we're doing it together, and self-publishing, of course, is entirely different too. So yeah, it's very rare that I have no say, or there isn't some back and forth, but sometimes there's very little back and forth. It's just like, okay, got to get the script, especially if there's a deadline that's very difficult and they start drawing immediately, but there's definitely more interaction. And oftentimes I, as a writer, will also say, I would really love to work with this person or this person. That's what I try to do, because you'll get a better book out of it. If that's not within my control, it happens, because not everyone's available at all times either.
Do you ever get to reject? Like you said, so it was sexier than I thought, but it's okay?
It is an issue. I am not the editor. If it is my stuff, I will say, oh, it is very, very rarely is it something like it's outright rejection. Usually it's more flagged as, oh, that could be a little problematic, and we patch it. We just fix it. Okay. We can do this, especially in the digital age. It's really much easier. You talk to some of the older artists back in the day, they had to FedEx things back and forth, physical things, and sometimes
Goodness, those have taken forever.
Yeah, yeah, even lettering now, it's like, okay, you know what, we'll just fix it in Photoshop or wherever, so that's much easier.
So you say you work with like, pre-established characters. Do you find that it's easier or harder when it's someone that like is very well known, like Wonder Woman, like everyone can like picture Wonder Woman in their head? Like, is that where it's kind of like a lot of the work might be kind of already nailed out for you, or at least like the blueprint, or do you find that limiting?
I think it really depends on the character. I do feel like I have more, and again, it depends who owns the character too, and how far they're willing to let you go. I think for less established characters, there's less at stake. I feel like I do definitely have more latitude, that I interpret a character differently. So what I did with Poison Ivy was a lot easier because she's considered a minor character, and she really did need more establishing. If I had done different things with Wonder Woman, what I'm basically doing with a character like Poison Ivy is making her a little bit more anti-hero. You're changing the nature of the character. You do that with something like Wonder Woman, there's going to be a lot of people saying something about it. Okay. So there is that for sure. But it also depends on who owns the character. Sometimes it's like, oh, let's go for it, right? I did some stuff for Kiss. Kiss has been doing comics since 1976, and I kind of did some stuff which I don't consider mind blowing, but it's very different. And Gene Simmons apparently was like, yeah, go for it. So it really depends on who controls that IP too.
Huh. I didn't know that about Kiss. Okay.
A lot of people don't, but if you can go see, there were a lot of Kiss comics because Gene and Paul are comics fans. They were probably the first to start essentially licensing their IP out to do that kind of stuff. So they had Marvel Comics back in the 70s.
Huh. Interesting. Anna, anything else?
Yeah. Is there a character or maybe a couple of characters or storylines that like you have always wanted to kind of work with and tell, but like for whatever reason, whether it's like the ending or there's just like something that isn't sticking with you, are there moments like that for you, like, or is there one that like sticks out for you? I feel it's always like, I enjoy telling people about like my failures. I feel like a lot of people learn more for failures of other people, kind of like, so you don't make the same mistake, or so you can learn from, my failures.
Don't feel like you're the only one that ever had that happen.
Yeah, you don't want to be like, you don't think you're the only one who's like been like, well, I can't figure it out.
Oh, it's always hard. Every freaking story is really hard. It's always like a failure until it finally gels, and you're like, I hope that's good enough. I'm going to send it to the editor, and I really hope it's okay. And then people are like, oh, we loved it. You never know, because we're so limited in our vision. You're like constantly thinking. I think everything I write is a failure, honestly. There's never a moment of like, eureka, I've nailed it. It's so good. Let me send it off now. It's never like that. Sorry to say. Maybe for some people it is, but I think most of the people I know are like, oh, good enough. I got to send it off, and you're like, it's amazing. And they're like, oh, no, so.
We are also watching the Q&A chat. So if anyone watching does have a question for us, I do have an eyeball on that chat. So feel free to kind of pop in.
Ask me anything.
Yeah, ask away.
You got me. So,
So,
I think a lot of people do ask, where do your ideas come from? It's like, you just got to be observant, look around. Almost everything I've written has come out of something that, like somebody I saw on the subway, or, that kind of thing.
one of the questions that kids ask authors a lot when we do author programs is, what superhero would you be? So there you go. What superhero would you be?
Yeah, you know what? It's so funny. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I really don't know. I did actually moderate a panel at San Diego Comic-Con with Todd McFarlane. And it was like kind of a high-powered panel where they were supposed to talk about what's the best superpower. And because I think it was Jonathan Hickman was a no-show at the panel. So my son actually stood in for him. He was like 12 at the time. And he was basically like, he can answer those questions, because he was like, well, it's, what did he say? I think he said it was flight, obviously, and he made a huge case for that. It's like, I think when we're adults, it's really hard. Like, I actually do not have a good answer for that. I don't know what it would be.
I think you're poison ivy. So there you go.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
I
Yeah,
think
you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like you guys are simpatico to me.
I think so. Yeah. I do get asked about writer's block. And I'm like, it's funny. When you have a deadline, you don't have writer's block, because you just have to do it.
You got to get it done.
You got to get it done. So my advice generally, if I do get stuck, it usually means there's something wrong with your script. Because otherwise it should just happen. I mean, I don't mean like it just flows out of you, but if you got writer's block, there's something not working for your script. So sometimes you do have to take a step back. I will go for a walk. I will literally take a shower, because apparently there's some advice where you need to separate your brain. You do something relaxing where you can sort of reset your brain, kind of, and then approach your script again from a different view. That will usually work, and also identifying frequently the problem is your most favorite scene, because you love the scene so much. You're trying to make it work for a story where it doesn't fit anymore. And so you just kind of have to be almost kind of Buddhist about it, let it go, move it aside, and reapproach your story. And sometimes what is the term? Kill your darlings. You don't have to kill your darling, but cut and paste your scene, move it to the bottom of the dock and try it again. And that usually works for me. It's like, oh, that's what the holdup was. I really, really love this action scene that, I had Wonder Woman doing this. And it's like, it didn't make sense anymore. That's why I could not get the script done, so just take that out. And then I was like, oh, that fixed it.
That's better. Yeah, that makes sense. That's good advice.
Do you start like in a specific spot? Like, do you come at it usually like with like an ending in mind, or like the big central plot is like kind of like your starting point? Where in kind of the storyline do you generally see yourself starting?
When I'm on a panel, like and you'll find writers do different things. They have different approaches. Me in particular, I focus on the ending, because I feel if I don't have an ending, I don't have a story. Because more experienced writers will say, oh, I'll just let the characters go where they will. Or like, wow, that's crazy. But then I realized they've been writing for 20 years. So they actually kind of know already. They're just, they've done it so much that they kind of know where their character's going to journey to. Especially if I'm writing, like Poison Ivy was a murder mystery. I have to figure out the ending,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes it's genre specific that you need to sort of focus on that. What I would say to people is don't worry about the middle. You got the beginning and the end. That's when you can figure out the middle part, but if you don't have your ending figured out, and the ending can change. I'm not saying it has to be that, but you need to sort of fix it first, go back, work out the middle, check the end. Does the end still make sense? Maybe you have to change the end now. And basically it's multiple passes until you've got basically your story.
I think we're going to have to stop, because we've got something coming up in another 15 minutes or something.
Oh my goodness, where did the time go?
I know, it was so great.
Well, I hope it was useful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
Sure.
I hope everyone, considers. I made it sound like it's really awful. It is really actually kind of great. I had a guy come to me yesterday, and he's like, "Your Wonder Woman made me cry," and then he scuttled away. I was like, "Oh my God!" It was so nice. He was really quite shy about it, but it's like this grown guy. I was like, "Wow, that really made my weekend."
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'm sure your stories touch lots of people. Absolutely.
Well, if I made that one guy cry, I was like, "Wow, I did my job."
That's pretty amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you. If you guys want to go ahead and leave, you can. Okay. Chris will shut us down when he's ready to shut us down. Thank you. It was great. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.